The Winchester 1866 would play a major role in the historical events of Custer's Last Stand and the Siege of Plevna. Fact or Fudlore? Stay tuned to find out. Welcome to the Milsurf Mike channel. As of the Henry 1860, about the only way to experience the Winchester 1866 Yellow Boy is via a reproduction or replica, generally made by one of the Italian companies Uberti, Cimarron, etc., since the real deal rifles and carbines will run you around $40,000 to obtain. Finding ammo, as well as a very tall order as vintage ammo, is pretty much in the collector arena only, and it'll cost you around $75 to $150 per round. And there's no new production ammo. An Uberti reproduction in 45 long Colt is what I present today, along with an in-depth history of the Winchester Model of 1866 Yellow Boy. While the Henry 1860 was very popular and the New Haven Arms Company struggled to keep up with the orders during the Civil War, definite weaknesses were found and improvements were desired. To modern sensibilities, some of these things seem like a no-brainer, but a repeating firearm that fired self-contained cartridges was still a very new concept in this time period. It might take wartime or martial use to discover that dumping several sets of 16 rounds would make where you place your offhand hot, since it didn't have a wooden handguard. The reason there was no handguard, of course, was the loading and magazine system, which used a plunger protruding through an open slit at the bottom of the magazine. Not only did this slit let dirt and mud into the magazine, you had to perform the Henry hop when the plunger crossed the path your offhand was blocking. Another problem with the loading system was the rotating collar at the muzzle, which had a tendency to rust in place if exposed to rain or mud. While New Haven Arms would take steps to address some of these problems, firearm issues wouldn't be the only issues that pushed the change and evolution from the Henry 1860 to the Winchester 1866. Before I go too much further, a great resource on the Winchester Company history is this book by Herbert Houze. This is the book that was my resource for much of the Winchester early company history. So make sure you check that out if you want to read deeper into this. Corporate structure and personnel issues would also push changes. In the 1860 video, I skimmed over Benjamin Tyler Henry's departure from the New Haven Arms Company and the formation of Winchester Repeating Arms Company. It simply isn't a matter of Oliver Winchester wanting to slap his name on the company. While history refers to Henry as New Haven Arms plant superintendent, he was actually an inside contractor who signed an exclusive 5-year deal with New Haven Arms in 1859. Henry was responsible for all aspects of production in the 1860, including providing and paying all his employees to produce the firearms in New Haven Arms factory, and he would sell the produced rifles and carbines to New Haven Arms for a fixed price. In lieu of a plant superintendent's salary, he would take home the profit, which is the difference in what New Haven Arms paid him, and the money he put out to produce the rifles. This arrangement worked well for him, as he made twice as much money than had he just taken a salary. Friction between Henry and Winchester would arise due to increased delays between the receipt of orders and delivery of rifles. Winchester would invest money into additional machinery, but it would appear in payroll records that Henry would not hire more contract workers. Winchester would lease the old Dwight Chapin and Arms Company in Bridgeport, Connecticut, and start filling it with machinery in December 1863, with eyes on expanding Henry rifle production. But actual expansion of production had to be put off until the expiration of Henry's contract in June 1864. The workforce in New Haven's factory would be reorganized and increased, and the Bridgeport factory would immediately be spooled up. Both would be run by salaried plant superintendents, as the experience with Henry would sour Winchester using the contract system. Winchester and his business partner, John M. Davies, would retire and transfer management of the firm to their sons on January 1st, 1865. Oliver Winchester would take a trip to Europe to possibly drum up foreign sales, as well as address the magazine problem, something I'll get to in a little bit. While in Zurich, Switzerland in May 1865, Winchester would receive a dispatch that the Secretary of New Haven Arms, along with Benjamin Tyler Henry, who was still a major stockholder, used power of attorney signed over to him to petition the Connecticut State Legislature to change the name of New Haven Arms Company to the Henry Repeating Rifle Company. Being rightfully pissed off, Winchester would cable Davies to call all the liens they held against New Haven Arms Company, or Henry Rifle Company now, to prevent them from operating business as usual under the new name and possibly force them into bankruptcy. He didn't challenge the name change, as the power of attorney use was legitimate. Winchester would return to the United States and set up his own privately owned company. Since he personally held the lease on the Bridgeport factory and equipped it himself, he just needed to refuse Henry Rifle Company use of the facility and machinery and recover the mortgage note. Privatizing the Bridgeport factory deprived Henry of more than 50% of production capability. This, along with Henry Repeating Rifle Company needing $300,000 to begin operations, would dissuade dissident stockholders from buying Winchester out. Winchester remained president in the company, forcing a stockholder vote. Oliver, his son William Wirt Winchester, and his business partner John M. Davies possessed more than enough stock to win the votes. Henry A. Chapin, a staunch ally of Winchester, would be nominated as company secretary. The Henry Repeating Rifle Company and the Henry Rifle would have to survive or die on its own. While incremental improvements to the Henry Rifle were already made, making a rifle to preclude more of Benjamin Henry's shenanigans, along with lagging sales, would create more incentives to create a new rifle. Some modifications already in the pipe included a sliding wooden handguard to cover the aperture, as well as replacing the rotating muzzle with just pivoting the handguard. Cartridges would be fed directly into the magazine, and the handguard would be slid back when full. This development was made by New Haven chief designer George W. Briggs and was incorporated into a contract of 500 rifles for the Kingdom of Bavaria in 1864. While Oliver Winchester was in Zurich, he contracted with Weber Rausch to create a new magazine system which had an outer sleeve over an inner tube where you just detached the tube to load the magazine. The Bridgeport Assistant Superintendent, James D. Smith, proposed a closed magazine in a wood stock, fed from the bottom of the receiver. He also redesigned the bolt, firing pin, cartridge extractor, and cartridge carrier. These changes not only made the rifle different from Henry's, but created a more positive action. In September of 1865, George Briggs was on leave from New Haven Arms Factory and would work on simplifying the Weber Rausch design by just sliding the whole magazine forward to load it with a stud to keep the cartridge from sliding back, and the magazine was simply locked into position. Oliver Winchester himself would propose that the tube itself have an opening at the rear with a catch, and he can just slide the handguard forward to expose it to load. He would take examples of this, as well as the Smith and Briggs designs to Europe in 1865 to drum up business, as the end of the Civil War would hurt sales domestically. He would patent his design in London. He traveled to Switzerland and Paris where 1,000 of the carbines would be ordered by France, likely to help arm those supporting Maximilian I in Mexico. Winchester would not patent this design in the United States as he didn't intend to sell them here. The rifle would have Winchester's magazine built on Henry receivers, as Smith receivers would require massive retooling at Bridgeport. Referred to as the improved Henry, 700 total would be made as the fall of Maximilian I in Mexico would slow things down, and the contract would be later satisfied by a shipment of 300 1866 carbines to France in 1867. Some would be sold privately, even though they lacked patent protection in the United States. This would technically be Winchester Arm Company's first rifle. Henry Repeating Rifle in New Haven would see a massive decline in orders, and by late November 1865, they would have only 25 employees. The Winchesters and Davies would call a stockholder meeting, offering to assume credits and liabilities by either purchase of the stock or a stock exchange to be issued by a new corporation. Benjamin Tyler Henry would try to forestall this with a lawsuit, but the lawsuit made very clear to stockholders that the New Haven factory was a sinking ship, and they voted to accept Winchester's offer on February 3, 1866. The new firm's charter would be modified on May 22, 1866. The machinery shipped to Bridgeport, and the payroll at New Haven closed on July 7. Benjamin Tyler Henry retired to obscurity, owning a small gun and machine shop in New Haven until his death in 1898. With the history of the intermediate rifles, as well as the transformation from New Haven Arms to Winchester Repeating Arms Company out of the way, we can finally talk about the rifle that made the said company, the Winchester Model 1866 Yellow Boy. Nelson King would enter service of Oliver Winchester in 1864 and would be named superintendent of the Bridgeport factory, when Winchester Repeating Arms Company, immediate predecessor, the Winchester Arms Company, was established on July 1, 1865. Later that year, he'd start working on the idea that'd be a staple of Winchester firearms for a generation, as well as show up on some military rifles around the world, namely the Swiss Vetterli. The side loading gate, which would become known as the King's Loading Gate, He would modify the cartridge carrier so a cartridge could pass directly into the magazine when it was closed and could be loaded through an aperture on either the left or right side of the receiver. This provided some major advantages over the Briggs and Winchester systems, and especially over the original Henry rifle. Not only did this reduce the steps for loading, but the rifle could be loaded or topped off without disabling the firearm. King's original improvement consisted of a 12-piece unit, due in part to a hinged cover over the aperture. He would receive patent number 55012 on May 22, 1866. Luke Wheelock would submit a design to Winchester that moved the loading system to where it was in front of the side plate, keeping from having to make a cut in the side plate. Although this presented some advantages, Wheelock's idea was abandoned. King would make a revision to his design during the summer of 1866, where there would be a single spring steel plate mounted to the inside of the side plate. All one had to do was push the cartridge inward and forward, and when the pressure was removed from the plate, it would return to its original position, holding the cartridge in. This design also removed the cover and 7 parts from the unit, leaving only 5. The cartridge carrier, side plate, spring plate, and 2 retaining screws. This would be produced with a brass-colored bronze frame called gunmetal instead of iron due to lesser tooling required. This would become the Winchester 1866 Yellow Boy. Now let's take a little closer look using my Uberti Replica. Alright, let's take a little closer look at our Winchester 1866 Yellow Boy and compare it to the original 1860 Henry. Now, of course, for both of these, I'm using my Uberti Replicas at 45 long Colt. Now, when you have them side by side, one of the first things you'll notice is that even though these are different lengths, they actually have the same capacity. And one of the big reasons for that is you have this rotating collar on the 1860. You gotta, put that plunger up, rotate that collar just so you can load it. And one of the disadvantages of that over the 1866 is that you have to take your firearm totally out of service almost to reload it or to even top it off. So really topping it off is impractical. Other complaints about this rotating collar is that they would have a tendency to rust in place, and they also allowed a lot of dirt to get in, on top of this slit underneath that allowed dirt to get into your magazine. Another thing you might notice about this is that this is all one piece of metal, the barrel along with the magazine, so that created a massive amounts of milling operations to complete, whereas your 1866, your magazine and barrel are separate. The magazine is just a simple tube, which is fairly easy to mill, and your barrel, you can make either round or octagon, whether you want. So that made for much more options and made everything simpler. Your 1866, you have the handguard right here, which you can't have on the 1860 because again, your plunger, and that helped protect your hand from heat. If you unload a couple magazines worth of rounds into your enemy, everything got really hot. When you just had metal here, and also on the Henry, you got to do your Henry hop. Maybe editing Mike will put in some footage of me shooting this where I have to move my hand as this plunger crosses the path. When you have the handguard here, one, you don't have to worry about the Henry hop, and two, it helps protect your hand from the heat. Of course, all of this is facilitated by the King's loading gate. Since you don't have to load it from the top, you can just load it from the side. All you gotta do is push it in, and that's very simple. And let's take a look at the inside here just to show how simple this is. Alright, I went ahead and unscrewed the side plate off camera just to show how simple the King's loading gate actually is. Sometimes it takes a genius to come up with a simple solution that's easy to mass produce and works well. As Schwagen once said, complexity is easy, simplicity is difficult. All this is, as it turned out to be, is a cutout into the side plate right there, and then you just have a piece of spring steel that's screwed into it. So when it's on, all you got to do is, once you load your round, it springs right back up. Now, as for the interior of the rifle, it's still the same as the inside of the Henry pretty much. You got your toggles on each side. And one thing I didn't show when I did the Henry that I'd like to show here is on the bolt, you'll note that the extractors are at 6, and 12. On the rimfire versions, there would be a firing pin at 3 and 9, so it actually hit the rim in 2 places to have better firing ability. Of course, this is center fire, so this has the pin in the middle to hit the center fire. And I'll talk a little later about some center fire conversions done by Winchester and independent gun makers themselves. So that's just a quick little demonstration of the 1866 versus the original Henry. Let's get into some more history on this rifle. Winchester would submit drawings and descriptions to various newspapers and magazines in the US and Europe to drum up publicity for the new rifle. Reactions would vary, but overall he would have good publicity from when the rifles were produced. Production would commence in August 1866, and the first completed arms would be shipped on September 15th. Production capabilities at Bridgeport far exceeded capabilities of Henry at New Haven, with 900 firearms produced in only the second month of production. 4,500 would be produced between September 15, 1866 and January 31st of the next year. This would only be a beginning, as rifles would sell very well internationally. Many of the first carbines produced in 1866 went to Chile. F.D. Suzanne in France was a huge fan of Winchester and his rifles. He is responsible for the improved Henry contract from Mexico. After the fall of Maximilian, he would take the remainder of the contract, 312 carbines and 1866s in France, while ordering 250 iron frame rifles. Iron frames would be a requirement for the Swiss rifle trials, which the world watched. Winchester would develop an iron frame musket version for these trials, which fired cartridges that met Swiss requirements. The receivers and lock works would be built in Bridgeport, and the barrels and stocks would be mounted by Weber Rausch in Zurich. These would also have a manual safety designed by Luke Wheelock. The Swiss Model 1866 sharpshooter fared well in the trials and would place many overseas eyeballs on Winchester's entry. One thing that tells that the Bridgeport factory was at max capacity at this point is that Winchester actually had discussions with Colt to have them help produce a possible Swiss contract. The Swiss would eventually opt for a domestically produced bolt-action rifle, the Vetterli, but this would be a 2-magazine fed via King's loading gate. Winchester would receive orders for the 1866 from Brazil, Japan, Siam, as well as France, the latter thanks to the Franco-Prussian War. Winchester would sell a large pile of Spencer carbines to France during the war. And now you may ask yourself, why was Winchester selling a competitor's product? As Winchester's fortunes grew post-American Civil War, many of his competitors would flounder. Winchester's tactic would be to outright purchase the scraps of these companies. A prime example of that would be in 1868, the Spencer Repeating Rifle Company would be in serious trouble and its principals wanted to sell. Winchester considered purchasing it for $400,000 but deferred. American Repeating Rifle Company would acquire Spencer on April 20th, 1869. They would have just been better off celebrating 4/20/69, as this new venture would go bankrupt by August. Winchester would scoop in and pick up the assets, machinery, patents, and all existing firearms for $200,000. Winchester would sell the machinery at auction for $138,000. Luke Wheelock would explore the now Winchester-owned patents to make improvements on the 1866, some of these showing up on the 1873 model. A December 11, 1869 Scientific American ad from Winchester showed that Winchester had for sale 2,000 Spencer repeating muskets, 30,000 Spencer repeating carbines, and 500 Spencer repeating short rifles. This is where the Spencers came from that went to France, along with 4,406 1866 carbines and muskets prior to the cessation of hostilities. Sometime late in 1869, a falling out occurred among Oliver Winchester, Nathaniel Wheeler, and James Wilson, as the latter two wished to raise the lease in the Bridgeport factory. By mid-1870, Winchester had convinced the board that a move back to New Haven was necessary, and they decided to purchase land there to build a new factory on August 27, 1870. Winchester would soon receive an order of 15,000 Model 1866 muskets and 5,000 carbines, as well as ammo for the Ottoman Empire. The timing of this was precarious, as they had to keep the Bridgeport facility running full bore, even during transfer of the machinery to New Haven. According to one barrel shop employee, quote, "In the winter of 1870, the shop was working on the Turkish contract for the 1866 model. There was a big drive and most contracts were working on 2 sets of hands, 10 hours each. The limit on the barrel job was 350 per day. During this period, the works was moved to their shop in New Haven. Such was the hurry for the work that no machine was stopped until trams were ready to transport to depot. In one case, at least, the last machine on the barrel job was in use till 12 o'clock. The belt was cut and the machine was in the new shop the next morning. But notwithstanding this drive, no machine could be in the new shop until it was taken down, cleaned, and painted." End quote. All the assets would be fully transferred by April 1871, ammunition production being the last to do so, as they wanted the Ottoman contract completed. The layout of the new factory provided optimum use, and this was demonstrated in the production of a second Ottoman order of 30,000 muskets, completed in just 6 weeks during the fall of 1871. This is a far cry from the only 200 Henry rifles produced per month during the Civil War. While Winchester rifles would continue to improve centerfire ammunition starting with the 1873 model, the 1866 would be produced through 1884, 4 years after Oliver, as well as his son William Wirt's death in 1880, and into the beginnings of the partnership of the new head of the company, Thomas Bennett, and a certain no-name firearms designer and maker from Ogden, Utah. The 1866 will also play into the story of a couple major historical events: the Battle of Little Bighorn, Custer's last stand in 1866, and the Siege of Plevna during the Russo-Turkish War in 1877. And I need to discuss whether some of this is fact or FUD lore, considering I am guilty of spreading egregious FUD lore on this matter in the past. First, we need to talk about Little Bighorn, also known in the U.S. as Custer's Last Stand, or the Battle of Greasy Grass to the Lakota. In simple terms, Custer split up his 800 men into 4 groups that planned to attack a very large Indian village instead of waiting for reinforcements. 2 groups would attack from the south, Custer's group from the north, and the last group protected the slow-moving pack. We know about the southern group's retreat after being not only outmanned, but outgunned, and Custer, along with all 210 of his men in the northern group, would die in the battle. Custer made about every tactical error that could be made in the battle, while the alliance of the Lakota and Cheyenne held up. While some of the survivors from the southern groups talked about Indian use of repeaters, this really wasn't brought to light until a range fire over the site in 1983 led to a coordinated metal detector/archaeological effort. Excavation and forensic analysis of the casings and bullets have returned estimates of at least 47 different types of guns, including at least 200 Winchesters going against Custer's men armed with single-shot trapdoor rifles and carbines, as well as 1873 Colt revolvers. Now, the 45-70 of the trapdoors have a huge range advantage over the 44 Henry, which is pretty much worthless over 300 yards, but that advantage would be with skilled marksmen. Many of Custer's men were fresh recruits, and the Army didn't allot much ammunition for training purposes. It was likely that in the heat of battle, these men would be blind firing, putting them at a huge disadvantage against Lakota warriors who were not only very skilled, but many possessed repeaters. Would better firearms for the U.S. cavalry change the battle? It's doubtful since Custer made so many other mistakes, but the Winchesters were present and were another advantage afforded to the Lakota and Cheyenne. The other battle often brought up when it comes to the 1866 is the Siege of Plevna during the Russo-Turkish War. And the common contemporary narrative of Russians being mowed down by Winchesters looks more and more to be FUD lore upon further examination. It seems like the source referenced by most, including NRA's American Rifleman, Wikipedia, and the internet in general, falls back to an August 1997 Man at Arms magazine article entitled The Plevna Delay, where it's claimed that Osman Pasha had 8,000 to 12,000 Winchesters to go with their standard Peabody Martini rifles. They would use the Peabodys for long range, then grab their Winchesters from when the Russians closed in. This claim also includes that the defenders would have 500 rounds of 44 Henry ammo next to their Winchesters. The internet will take this and extrapolate it further that this made the Russians wary of their Berdans and caused them to start searching for repeaters themselves, leading to the Mosin Nagant. FUD lore that I spread myself in a video shortly after getting my replica. When deciding to make this video, I remember that a certain bearded gentleman who is an expert on old guns suggested pretty strongly that there weren't many Winchesters in Plevna in his Berdan 2 video. Luckily, the certain gentleman pointed me to some sources to dig deeper into, and I owe a debt of gratitude to Matthias. A little background to the war itself. Russia and the Ottoman Empire had gone to war several times over the past couple centuries prior to the Russo-Turkish War, most recently in the Crimean War. The Ottomans won this with major support from the British and French. They'd also taken on a lot of debt. This was also a wake-up call for the new Tsar, Alexander II, to modernize Russia, as it had stagnated under Nicholas I, living off its reputation for defeating Napoleon for several decades, while the rest of Europe modernized. The 1870s would see crop failures and floods for the Ottomans, and the Sultan would raise taxes. This resulted in uprisings by the Bulgarians and Herzegovinians. The Ottomans would very harshly put down the Bulgarian uprising, committing many atrocities that shocked Europe, while failing to put down the Herzegovinian uprising. Serbia and Montenegro would declare independence, and the European powers tried to solve the Eastern crisis. Sultan Hamid II refused their demands, so Russia would declare war. Atrocities in Bulgaria meant that Western European powers would not side with the Ottomans, and Russia had an agreement with Austria-Hungary about divvying up the Balkans. Romania would allow Russia to cross their territory and would then claim independence themselves, joining the effort against the Ottomans. Fighting against the Russians, Romanians, Serbians, and Montenegrins would spread the Ottomans thin. The Russians would quickly take Nikopol. Osman Pasha would initially look to meet the Russians at Nikopol, but saw that he was too late and decided to stalk and fortify Plevna. It would be the Turks' valiant defense of the city where we hear about the myth of the Winchester 1866. If you remember from a little earlier, the Turks had ordered 45,000 muskets and 5,000 carbines from Winchester in 1870 and 71. By 1876, it was determined that the Winchesters weren't suitable for military use, and the Ottomans had adopted the Peabody Martini made by Providence II in Rhode Island as their military rifle. Something you can learn much more about by checking out C&R Arsenal's Primer 172. Pasha had enough time to have the Peabody's ranged and marked prior to the Russians' arrival. The Turks also had a quantity of Snider rifles. The Russians would be armed with Berdan II rifles, which are single-shot bolt-action rifles, as well as older Krinker breech-loading conversions. Just think of it as a Russian trapdoor. The Berdan IIs were ballistically equal to the Peabodys and actually possessed some other advantages, but they weren't sighted for the distances required to shoot back at the Ottomans who had already previously ranged the area. It was the prior sighting that allowed the Turks to rain bullets down on the Russians from as far as 2,000 meters away. The fortress is well stocked, and Russian frontal assaults would be repelled 3 times. The Russians had finally prevailed not by force, but by out-engineering the Turks after command was given to a German military engineer turned Russian general Eduard Todleben, who was in Pasha's shoes during the Crimean War and the Siege of Sevastopol. He would place Russian redoubts facing Ottoman redoubts, cut off all supply routes, and dam the river going into the city, powering mills that ground stored wheat into flour. He would release the water all at once, destroying all the mills. The city was isolated. Resources were kept for the military, and any civilian caught hoarding was publicly executed. As the cold of November and December approached, Pasha decided to attempt to fight his way out. While he took thousands of Russian lives, the Ottomans were finally trapped and Pasha himself was injured. Pasha would surrender. This left the road to Constantinople open, although the Western powers would diplomatically halt this, with a little threat thrown in by the British Navy, as they didn't want to see the Russians gain too much power. It'd be during the final breakout where a few Winchester 1866 carbines would be used, given to those who didn't normally have rifles, such as artillerymen and some officers. Contrary to the 8,000 to 12,000 number stated in the Man of War article, the Russians would only capture 200 Winchesters. Where did this discrepancy come from? The legend of the Winchesters, when the Russian attackers got within 100 meters, the defenders would grab their Winchesters and open fire, would start in a French book written in 1878, something I'm going to put across the screen just because I can't pronounce it. And it seems this account would be the one to stick. Almost every source from within Plevna, including Frederick William von Herbert, a British citizen who joined the Ottoman army and was at Plevna, Talant Bey, the adjunct of the Turkish Supreme Commander at Plevna, and Osman Pasha himself, would contradict the French source. Bey would categorically state that the Winchesters were not used by infantry and only by cavalry, only to be replaced by the end of the war due to their poor performance. Herbert in his book only mentioned they were given to some officers for the final attempted breakout. Pasha would also barely mention the Winchester in his accounts, corroborating Herbert's observations. What of the rain of bullets on the Russian soldiers in the third attack of Plevna? This would be explained by Strecker Pasha, a Bavarian officer turned into Ottoman general. He would say that infantrymen given the Peabody Martini would be drilled in rapid fire. Each man had access to 600 rounds of ammo and laid devastating fire upon the Russians. Since they were in a static, fortified position, they could fire in a manner that might cause mistaken impression that the magazine-fed rifles were being used. Now that we have taken a deep, yet not deep enough dive into the history involving the 1866, let's talk about experiencing it in the 21st century. As mentioned earlier, the real deal will run you well into 5 figures, and even if you obtain one, you better learn to somehow make 44 Henry rimfire ammo, as that ammo is in the collector realm itself and will run $100 a round. There are a few centerfire versions made by either independent gunsmiths who converted the original rimfire rifles, or even by Winchester themselves, as they made a small order of these for Brazil who wanted something to match their 44 Nagant revolvers. Realistically, the closest you can come to shooting one is obtaining a replica or reproduction by Uberti. They come in several calibers including 38 Special, 44-40, and 45 Long Colt, among others. Mine is in 45 Long Colt, which isn't too far off ballistic-wise from the original Henry round. These are fun to shoot, and if you own a trapdoor rifle, you really get to experience the difference in rate of fire. Now, more modern centerfire smokeless ammo does give you a better trajectory over the original 44 Henry, which had the ballistics of a brick, but you can still also witness how the trapdoor would be a much more effective weapon if you needed to shoot something at long range. Too bad I've yet to obtain a Peabody Martini for a comparison to it. It isn't all rainbows and roses with this replica though. You quickly learn that you cannot baby the lever and have to put some force on it. Some people have had extraction issues, while I've noticed some loading issues. I haven't met a gun I didn't like. Back when he was known as Stewie 6096, experienced this with his 38 Special version of the Uberti 1866, especially when he used different grain rounds. I'll include a link to his video below. I let Milsurp World Danny shoot mine when we were on a filming outing out of Milan. And he experienced this same failure to feed, pushing the bullet all the way into the case. I also looked at my first video I made on this years ago, the one where I spread the egregious FUD lore, and it looks like while I didn't have the same jam Danny did, I did have to stop a couple times myself. That aside, this replica is good to have for demonstrative purposes in comparisons with the military rifles of the time, as well as the rifle it replaced, the Henry, which if you want to learn more about, as well as the beginning of the story discussed in today's video, click over here. Please join the GOA and get $5 off your membership with the link below. Thank you for watching, and as always, have a great day.